And that was fantastic. Carroll, let's hear from Oakland.
Yes, let's hear from Oakland. Let's hear it for Oakland. I also have to give a major thanks to the organizers of this event. This is an amazing opportunity. So thank you to stand amongst these amazing brown women is a huge opportunity, and I'm grateful. Um, I will start by saying that my entire existence and for why I'm here is to make the world a little bit better. And because I came in this package, it creates a resonance that I feel around certain issues, particularly around housing. For what my grandmother leaving Mississippi and Alabama, my paternal and maternal, in search of housing and work and jobs with their partners, is just a part of my personal lineage around where is home for Black folks, having to leave for the warmth of other suns, if I can use the title of another book that was written around the Great Migration, leaving the Deep South, going to the Midwest for a better life is something that we are still having to do as Black people, specifically Black women, and understanding that the crimes and the violence of displacement and gentrification is impacting Black women, similar to the ways that mass incarceration has impacted Black men, gives reason and rise to the movements that you see, not just in Oakland, but around the world. I was recently in conversation with Erica Huggins of the Black Panther Party around living with the MST and her work in Brazil, and thinking about what does it look like to expand that type of organizing in the city of Oakland, where so many of our streets and underpasses and little pockets of our 400,000 plus city looks like another country. And I always preface that to say that I recently heard a poem, read an article about immigrants moving from South America to the United States. And the saying was, I am here because you were there. And that just means that a lot of the immigration, a lot of the disinvestment and the chaos that we see in what we call third world countries is because of US imperialism and racialized capitalism. So when I say that in the richest state, one of the wealthiest states in the world, in California, it baffles me that so many of our cities look like third world countries that have been disinvested in because of American imperialism. But it should not be a surprise. This has been history and generations and years of disinvestment and oppression. And I'm just humble and appreciative to be a part of a movement that is challenging that very existence. And so while I know some people think that my position on city council is relevant, I would say that my experience in being a homeless Black mother myself, housing insecure, working with individuals who are in that very same position is the most relevant of my experiences. It's not the academia that I've been through. It is not the seminars or the coalitions that I've been a part of. It is my experience and my connection to my Black mother and grandmother and great grandmother, and knowing that I am now on the soil of some of the most richest resistance movements that the world has known. So I'm so proud to be in Oakland, California, where there are many women and other folks, other siblings who want to be a part of this. And I firmly believe that because what we're experiencing has been legislated and structured and is systemic, it can be uncreated. I think I just created that word, but it was created so we can dismantle it. And that is what I'm working to do. And being on the other side as an elected official right now, it gives me the opportunity to see, number one, how the sausage was made, and not just theorize about it and give perspectives about what I think was happening, but actually see it. Like right now, the world is up in arms and really concerned about homelessness. But I'm seeing the ways that it is not actually being programmed to end, being sitting in my seat, that the structural inequities that have been manufactured through barriers to employment, barriers to education, barriers to every area of people activity. Everything has had the impact of giving access to certain people and not others. Oakland is in the news right now for hate speech and hate crimes against Asian Americans. But what's not being stated is much of the news cycle and the news stories that are being uplifted are of individuals who have a history of mental health issues, which come because of a lack of access to health care. They are unsheltered, which means they do not have an adequate place to live. And they are hungry. We found out recently, one of the perpetrators in an incident used the credit card of an individual to go buy Taco Bell after this shoving incident. And one of them was an attack on someone that wasn't Asian. So all of these things I give as evidence to say that there are some deep issues that need to be addressed that take care of the root causes of crime, so that housing, being one of the major impediments to being able to live a healthy lifestyle, needs to be addressed before we think about the punitive measures that are going to penalize people for crimes of poverty, because that's really what this is about. It's about poverty. And the women who are standing up to address this head on in my city are Black women. And so when we took over that house on Magnolia Street, I had no idea that it would have the reverberative effects that it had. I did not expect a militarized eviction with tanks and AR-15s for women and children. I didn't expect that we would get recognition from the Vatican for doing that what we felt was a simple action to bring attention to the housing crisis. But I'm seeing now, after being in office for maybe 9 weeks, that was one house, and I'm willing and ready and will begin the process of actually taking property because things are not moving fast enough to address the need. So folks were concerned that we took over one property, but now they messed around and let me get in office where I can do a lot more. So I oftentimes, as an organizer, do not center myself, even though I've had the same experiences of the target populations that I work with. So it's difficult for me to speak, especially being an introvert. I actually do not like it very much, but the cause that I'm fighting for is so much bigger than myself as an individual that I feel motivated to not only just share my personal experiences and those of people around me, it's also to highlight the issue that this is a manufactured problem. And unless we step up and be courageous about pushing back on racialized capitalism and all of its impacts, then we'll continue to get what we get. And right now, things are crumbling, I think, in the areas of speculator-owned housing, flipping, markets deciding who has access to affordable shelter, that we all need to work together to strike while the iron is hot, because this is our moment. When we took over that house, we started to see in Los Angeles, Philadelphia, North Carolina, London, some folks reached out to us from the Philippines, like, thank you, we're gonna do that too. I recently got a call from some people in Louisiana who are experiencing the same thing with their church. And they're like, can you come down here and help us? We wanna take our church back. So we have to be bold enough to know that we deserve it. And even all of the trolls that are coming out on Twitter to try to dissuade my supporters and the people who want to do more of that, to push back on these rules and the laws that have been created to keep housing away from us, it's just emboldening people so much more. So I'm in the process of changing policy, rewriting laws, and still continuing to nurture the movement, so we have more of what you saw in November of 2019, because the need is only increasing. So the movement continues.
That's amazing. Thank you so much. Sarah Broom.
So I'm just beyond full already to be in the company of all of you. So I'm reporting from New Orleans, I'm happy to say. And so I just wanted to talk about the ways in which I decided as a way to sort of fortify myself against historical dispossession, that my life's work, my nonfiction writing work especially, which, you know, on the surface of things might appear to be about houses and architecture, but most importantly for me, structure, that it would actually be about navigating this sort of tepid and tenuous ground that I inherited, but it would also always foreground as part of itself names and naming. The names people decided to call themselves and the names Black people call places that have since been renamed, knowing that dispossession is really about stripping. It's about trying to recast. It's about decontextualizing. And this is something I think I saw very early on in my own maternal line and lineage, how the Black women I knew made a great show of force by reclaiming themselves, how my grandmother, Amelia, and her sister and her cousins and everybody else who were fake cousins created a kind of Black New Orleans cosmology by renaming themselves according to feeling and not logic. I keep thinking about and feeling very haunted by these stories that make for me a kind of origin, which is how I know that when we talk about dispossession, when we talk about being outside of context and story and life or in the dominant American narrative, that is something we feel as a form of displacement ultimately. And one of the things I keep coming back to is this section in Gail Jones's Corregidora, which summarizes it all when she says, my great grandmama told my grandmama the part she lived through that my grandmama didn't live through. And my grandmama told my mama what they both lived through. And my mama told me what they all lived through. And we were supposed to pass it down like that from generation to generation so we'd never forget, even though they burned everything to play like it didn't never happen. When my mother was 8, my mother, who is now 80, was 5, she heard the story from her mother of how her grandmother's land was stolen. This actually was land in Raceland, Louisiana, one of my other native places. How my great grandmother signed away her land in Raceland after being duped. I remember how within the telling of the story, how the thieves suddenly became them and those people, indirect pronouns to say what my mother knew directly. My mother's mother, my grandmother Amelia, would then go on to buy a small piece of land in St. Rose, Louisiana, 2 miles from where she was born on the Ormond plantation. How when I was young and visiting St. Rose, I practiced reading the brochures that were scattered all over her front stoop, what to do in case of chemical explosions. My grandmother's long fought for family home was in Cancer Alley, a top toxic ground. How then similarly, my mother went on and bought a house at 19, a yellow house in New Orleans East, and made another world for me and my 12 siblings. How she said that on move-in day, they had to build the ground back up. How on the first day in the house, it was already sinking. We see everywhere in this country, and it is terrifying that for Black women, especially, there is no such thing as return on investment. And now I'm thinking of this woman, Rhonda Favre, who lost her job last year as a short cook in New Orleans in a hospitality industry primarily fueled by Black people for white tourists, which was of course crushed during COVID. How now Rhonda Favre and her 2 small children face eviction. How in this short documentary detailing her plight, Rhonda Favre is sitting on her front porch with her back against her house, but also in the frame, we see this whir of traffic on Claiborne Avenue, on a bridge, an overpass, just a feet away from where she's sitting. This section of the interstate built at the tail end of the civil rights movement. meant that 155 Black-owned homes were cleared. It decimated the Black shopping district where my mother and so many others shopped. To think that when this bridge was erected, Rhonda Favre's mother was likely a Black dreaming child in a city that she loved, trying to take claim somehow. And now Rhonda Favre sitting next to the bridge, facing eviction, saying about the government, I put my trust in them. My family who didn't put their trust in them, they died. My friends who didn't listen, they died. So we stayed home. And in the process, what am I rewarded for? The pandemic, this mental stress, it's sucking everything out of me. 59% of Orleans Parish, where I was born, is Black. 82% of evictions right now involve Black people. 57% are Black women. In Louisiana, you cannot withhold your rent if the landlord does not make repairs. In sweltering 105-degree heat, a landlord does not need to provide an air conditioner. This is law. We know that for Rhonda Favre and her two children, she has very few options about where to go after she is evicted. In the days following the levees breaking, AKA what some call Katrina, in that land grab, perfectly fine housing developments, about 4,400 units, mostly Black women-led, were bulldozed to create mixed income housing, where the few former public housing residents who actually got in could be evicted for the slightest ambiguous infraction. For instance, for a person sitting on their porch who was not named on the lease, which is, as far as I know, what porches are for. After Katrina, families, mostly Black women led, were pushed to the same exact part of the city where my mother bought into her dream in 1960 in New Orleans East, that had, since the 80s, years after my mother's investment, shifted from the so-called city of dreams to being called the land of no return with the requisite divestment we all know about. New Orleans East, areas of which have the highest rates of COVID infection in all of New Orleans and in many parts of the nation. So that many New Orleanians right now, on this day in 2021, are suffering a kind of displacement, a level of violence that has not been seen since August of 2005. This, as New Orleans realtors report their busiest season ever. All of this in a city so often feminized and referred to as she and her. How we love this city. She is so divine, people are very happy to say, where matriarchal family-led families are the norm, where women make place, world, seen and unseen. These women who are the recorders and keepers, the fighters, the economic engines. How my Aunt Clara in Raceland kept the trunk full of pictures and papers to document. Papers tell so many stories, my mother loves to say. This tenuous whole, the impermanence, permeates my work and creates a kind of positioning, which I think invites me and also incites me to great despair and anger. But I am so moved by the women I know in Louisiana, in Raceland, Louisiana, in New Orleans, who fight, who have taught me not just to map Black women and their dispossessions, but also their lives, their victories, their roots, to celebrate beyond the despair, the victories large and small, so that we know that we exist, holding on to ourselves, reclaiming our names and each other in the process. Thank you.
Oh my God. Thank you, Sarah. That was great. I guess the first thing don't have a question. The question I have is whether you have anything to say to each other, just because for me, especially listening to Keisha-Khan and Sarah, that this is where you get a sense of what the Black diaspora is, because what you are describing in Bahia is so maps onto what Sarah is describing as well, especially the tourist aspect, the way that you know, there's an industry around Black tourism, the space, Black space, but there is a accompanying hostility to the permanent presence of Black people. And so there's a celebration of the imprint of Black culture and you know, what people imagine Black culture to be. But the real estate industry, the developers don't want actual Black people there. And I know that Brandy Summers has is writing about this, about Oakland as well, and has written about this in Washington, DC. And so I just wonder if you guys, you as well, Carroll, if you all have anything to say to each other about the kinds of intersections and overlaps of the various places that you were familiar with, and how this knits together a story of familiarity, of you know, both dispossession, but also something enduring about Black people as well. I think the last part of what Sarah said is important to this also, which is, this is not just a story about despair and victimization. It is also a story about resistance and the struggle, but also the worlds that we constitute among ourselves as well. So I don't know if you guys have anything to kind of reflect on that.
Look, we're all just waiting for the other to speak.
I'm a teacher. I'll start calling on people. Keisha-Khan, I'm going to call on you.
There's so much I could say. I mean, how do you go from being, you know, the center of the universe in terms of, I mean, Brazil and not Brazil, but specifically Salvador is known as a Black Mecca, right? Bahia is known as a Black Mecca. You go from being kind of the center of how people understand themselves to being a nuisance, right? So I think that's really fascinating. But I do think there's so many scholars have written about that urban redevelopment and actually the rebuilding of the Brazilian so-called man and Brazilian nation is really a whitening project. It's really about Europeanizing, recreating themselves in the world. I mean, Bolsonaro doesn't, you know, link himself to Trump by happenstance. He links himself because there's a certain kind of aspiration about what Brazil wants to be in the world, right? And part of what it wants to be is a whiter nation. This almost, I think now they're up to almost 54% or 53 or 54% of the country that self-identifies as Black. Part of the project is about eliminating the Black population. There's a genocidal project taking place. You see it evident in the lack of good public education, public health. You see it now in how it's playing out in terms of a real genocidal practice and the handling of coronavirus. But we had seen it before in terms of the mass militarization of the biggest cities in Brazil, in terms of the fact that, sorry, that's my son who happened to go to the bathroom right now. But of course, you see it already playing out, right? That the militarization of Brazilian cities, that there's already a genocidal project that extends to the transatlantic slave trade. Vera Benedito, a scholar in Brazil, has always said, how is it that Brazil had the lion's share of the slave trade in terms of the vast majority of African descendants went to Brazil, how they would end up, this perception of them being this happy-go-lucky land, right? And I think there's been a lot of effort at the state level that goes into, in essence, eliminating the Black population. I think there's something to be said in terms of using that term. The idea is to eliminate importing Europeans and killing off the Black people. And you see that taking place. I mean, the 500,000, almost that, they're almost in terms of reaching in the coronavirus pandemic, the vast number that are being killed on an everyday, every year, on an everyday basis throughout Brazilian cities. So I would say that but at the same time, why do people go to Brazil? What do they want to consume? What is Brazilian culture without African descendant culture? So there's this contradiction taking place, but they don't want actual Black people even to assume any sort of power, access to power. Part of one of the things that we investigated, and we've been written, a lot of scholars like Tiana Pachel and others have talked about, is how even affirmative action has been so threatening in Brazil, right? So there's so much more, I could say about this, but the fact that housing is so precarious, the fact that this idea that people should be removed from some of the most vibrant spaces of the city, to move them further and further away from infrastructure, basic public infrastructure, is really about absolute neglect and abandonment, and hoping that this population will eventually just disappear, right? And I think I don't say that lightly. This is something that it is a project. This is something that is actually happening. It's a genocidal project taking place that we have to pay attention to. And you see this in other predominantly Black contexts. I've written about, even in the context of Jamaica, Jamaicans don't always want to acknowledge the anti-Black racism taking place, but the reason why the Rastafari movement was so attractive to people and masses of Black people fled urban areas was precisely because of how anti-Black racism played out. And the reason why Rastafari communities were demolished is precisely because of the kind of project in terms of Black preservation and Black autonomy that they were also preaching and trying to preserve on the island. So I think it's a much more complicated project that we have to pay attention to in terms of how it's happening hemispherically. You see it in Colombia, you see it in Ecuador, you see it all over, with the increase in immigration from Haitians throughout Latin America, Venezuelans, Black Venezuelans specifically, into other parts of Latin America. We have to pay more attention to what's happening in terms of how people are being pushed further and further away from even just the most vibrant, the most productive parts of cities. I'll stop there, but I've learned so much. Obviously I admire the work of Sarah Broom and Carroll Fife is so admirable. And it's amazing to see precisely how people are documenting how Black women are not just fighting dispossession, but how they are carrying on their everyday lives and surviving and thriving in these spaces and refusing to leave and making claims. And there was a question about occupation that I can answer afterwards.
Sarah or Carroll?
I'm just going to throw out there that I want us to create a documentary about these stories and these issues that we're lifting up. I'm just going to say that. NBC will be releasing a story on Moms for Housing that is not told through the lens of Black women, that does not tell the story of actually what happened in Oakland, and that does not lift up the very real essence of what needs to happen as a resolution. So I want us to think about using the expertise that's on this Zoom right now to figure out how that we tell this story and connect it to the diasporic stories of Black folks in all of these different spaces. Because what I found is that areas that have very strong resistance movements, resistance to oppression, are the places where Black folks tend to be under attack the most. And so when I recently visited Jamaica and stayed with a maroon village, I got to see, I got to learn a lot of that history firsthand. But then going into some of the cities, I was just taken aback. Number one, because of the similarities to some places in Oakland, but also seeing where people actually fought back so vigorously, and how economic sanctions and policing and all of these different things converge together to create an ongoing system of oppression that doesn't allow for real growth. I want to see those stories. I want my daughter to hear those stories. She's organizing right now to go do a reparations campaign for students in the public school system. And this would just, if we are telling our stories from our own voices and perspectives, that could be, it will be powerful for the next generation. So I just wanted to throw that out.
Thank you.
So I guess part of what I'm thinking a lot about and hearing the two of you is about in New Orleans, the ways in which, you know, shortly after August 2005, 73% of Black New Orleanians were displaced. And I think about a third of that number has yet to return, and how there really is, when you talk about sort of sending people out to the sort of extremities of a place, I guess for me, the question always comes up of why certain places are deemed the outer limits in the first place, right? I think that's a critical question, because in my, where I come from, New Orleans East is, you know, quite vastly larger than the rest of New Orleans. It's just that it has a great number of Black people. So it's somehow considered the outer limits, as if we've gone to another planet. But this is a place where people live diverse and vastly fluid lives, right? And so part of it is the sort of like rethinking about how we think of place, how we think of centrality, particularly in our American story, right? We see it changing quite often. The other thing is, interestingly about New Orleans, and I'm thinking very much about the women who face eviction, is that New Orleans is the only place in the nation that has an entirely charter school, public school system. Every single school is a charter school in the public school system. And we don't have enough time for me to get into what the implications of this might be. But basically what this means is that in a community of less than 400,000 people, and I like always to talk about the population of New Orleans because it really puts it in context, we're talking less than 400,000 human beings in a city, right? In that context, where community is the thing that creates place, children are literally taking buses from their neighborhood and passing up 4, 5, 6, 7 schools to go to a randomly assigned charter school. And hearing both of you, Keisha-Khan and Carroll Fife, I'm like, oh, there are these places where our experiments take place in America. And I'm very interested in the question of who gets experimented on, and why. And I feel right now that so much of what we're discussing about diaspora, about housing as a human right, about our own ability to make a claim to a place is somehow still very much tied to the fact that people are presented with a so-called option of choice that is not a choice at all. And that feels very American too. I keep feeling very caught up in American mythology these days because I keep seeing it playing out in our American cities in ways small and very large. And water, of course, is one, right?
Thank you. That's great. I think we're short on time. We have one question that is kind of directed at Carroll. And so let me read this question, and then I want to add one thing onto it so that maybe each of you can just have a final comment. This question is, based on your experience so far as a city council member, how does the city's relationship to debt, municipal debt, help or hinder the process of dismantling structural inequalities? And what I would add to that is really a question about there are many things we could talk about as far as what should be done, what can be done. But I'm, thinking in each of your various contexts, what are some of the things that you think can be done to address the issues that we've raised today? It doesn't, it's not a full worked out program, but based on things that people are actually doing, based on your own knowledge of the situation, history, experience, what do you think that we should be thinking about in terms of how to address these issues? But I'll start with you, Carroll.
Well, I appreciate the participant for the question. I think the municipal debt that we hold as a city is the narrative that's spun out when the city doesn't want to do certain things, like correct the generations of disinvestment in Black communities. Although there is a reality to the ongoing debt increasing, it being a large percentage of our budget and our responsibilities, it is unsustainable. And the police and fire departments are the majority of that debt. It's the unfunded liabilities through pensions and retirement of our high-paid public service officers that take up a lot of our debt. And so when we are trying to think creatively about what we can do to rectify the disinvestment in our poor communities, particularly Black communities, that's always brought up about what we can't do because of these obligations that we have. So there are many solutions that we're looking into, one being reimagining public safety to take away some of the sworn officers doing certain duties and civilianizing that work that's being led by Cat Brooks and the Defund OPD Coalition. And I will say that I do not believe that there's a coincidence to the cities where they're seeing an anti-Asian spike in crime as some of the same cities where defund the police departments are gaining traction. I'll say that I don't personally believe that there's a coincidence there, especially in places that have a strong progressive grassroots movement. So it's a big problem, and we are looking for creative solutions to address that, to bring in more revenue to the cities through progressive tax measures like taxing the rich and creating a public bank and other solutions that we're trying to advocate in the city of Oakland. But I will say that the issues that we face are not new. Urban renewal is Negro removal is not a new sentiment, and it's something that we have to be collaborative in our processes with the community and other organizations that want to assist thinking through new ways to get through those challenges.
That's great. Thank you. Sarah or Keisha-Khan?
I just wanted to add and say, I mean, there was a question about also occupation versus squatting. And one of the reasons why I also kind of moved away from a term of favela, which is what a lot of the activists did not use the term favela, is the sort of kind of informality idea that you're just, squatting on the land. And even moving away from those kinds of terms in my own work, I don't use the term favela, I don't use the term squatters. These are people who are occupying land that was already stolen from people. And also very extensive histories of relationship between African descendants and indigenous folks that is not about a certain kind of possessive, but capitalistic relationship to occupying space, but really about building communities and building lives on the land, right? These are already collectively communities that were stolen from Africa, forced to the Americas, to live on lands that were considered oftentimes not valuable. Beachfront lands and coastal lands were not valuable, alongside Native Americans or indigenous peoples in South America. And now it in a reconfiguration what coastal lands mean for certain kind of tourism, now telling people who were pushed to those lands to then have to move further and further away to some distant periphery, closer to the interior, right? So I think we have to move away from a certain kind of sense of the informality. These are people making claim and building lives in spaces where they were enslaved and for generations. So I think I have to really rethink what that means and what belonging means. And I just want to push the documentary by Kurt Otterson. He does a documentary that compares New York City Black Lives Matter struggles with the occupations in Sao Paulo and the occupations or the struggles against demolition in Cape Town, right? So I think those are ways that these transnational conversations are taking place. And I just want to say that I've started to write a little bit more about the occupations in Sao Paulo to understand that these are oftentimes vertical wastelands. And you see that also in places like Salvador, vertical wastelands that are not being used, hospitals that have been abandoned, school buildings that have been abandoned, that Black people are putting them to use. I do think that there's a moral imperative about how we think about housing, how we think about shelter. And there is a universal language about human rights, but it goes beyond that. It goes about an ethic of care. It goes about what kind of society we want to live in, that we spend thousands of dollars. I mean, I think the last report was how many trillions of dollars since 9/11 on wars, right? How many trillions of dollars we spent on wars, but not making our society more housing secure, right? I think we have to think about that. Why should this country be spending trillions of dollars on wars and bombs and drones and public education being so scarce, right? That we're here struggling, trying to figure out how to handle a pandemic. So I think we're figuring about why should housing be so expensive and taking up 40, 50, 60% of people's income, right? So I think we have to really rethink how we see housing in this country in a way that we need to maybe, expand it in terms of seeing it as something that we should think that we should want for everyone, right? In the same way that we think we need running water, we need other basic necessities. It shouldn't be something like a luxury item. It shouldn't be something that you have to, I think we just need to rethink what family, the different kinds of family structures, who lives where. My mother is an attorney, as I spoke about earlier, and people lose their children because they don't have places to live, right? They lose their houses, they lose their children because they don't have running water in their houses or electricity in their houses. So I think and I think we just have to think about, how much money we spend on policing people who jump turnstiles, on incarceration in this country, on fighting wars for democracy elsewhere when we're living in very undemocratic spaces where housing is seen as something, that should cost so much. It's just a significant commodity in our lives, right? I think we have to really rethink why we've invested so much in wars versus in clean water, why Flint, Michigan still doesn't have clean water. I mean, to me, it's on the point of ridiculousness that people say, well, we're going to be able to achieve that. Well, what kind of society do we want? So I think we have to really ask ourselves that just as basic questions. This is not, and I should say that as an academic, when I first started off, people thought that, why would you want to write about that? I was like, these are feminist issues. These are Black liberation issues. And if we don't put those at the fore of what we're doing, why are we here, right? When we go to cities like Oakland and we see the homeless population, one of the biggest things that foreigners comment on when they come to the United States is, one, the poor quality of the food. Two, how much homeless people they see, right? So I think that's something that really defines American inequality, and we miss an opportunity at really being a democracy and a great nation if millions and millions of people are housing secure, right? I just want to end on that note.
Sarah, do you have any final thoughts?
I think these women have said it all. I don't think I have very much more to add, other than how thrilled I have been to be part of this. And I have 1,000 things now I need to go look up and research and watch and read.
Well, if I may add to the reading list, Muskegon Heights, Michigan is the other fully charterized public school district in the United States. It's a tiny town but it is the city where my grandfather was the first African-American city council member. And Diane Ravitch writes about New Orleans and Muskegon Heights as the two charterized public school systems in America. And I also want to just make a distinction about squatters versus occupation. Squatters was used as a bit of a pejorative for the moms and moms for housing, as a tactic that these drug abusing, no father having households, unemployed welfare queens did in order to steal a house. But the reality is the difference between squatting and occupation for us, squatting is like a legal endeavor that you can engage in the state of California, where if you take adverse possession of a home for 5 years, you can become the legal owner, but it's done under the cover of darkness and in quiet where people don't know. And we made it intentional to make a spectacle of what was happening because it was necessary to bring attention to the violence of houselessness and frequency in which Black women were experiencing and are experiencing it in the city of Oakland. Squatting is, taking up space, and I don't knock the folks who do that as a tactic or as just a survival mechanism, but it was very different than what we were doing in terms of occupying a space for a political purpose to spark a movement. So I just wanted to say that there's technical similarities, but what we did was completely different.
Thank you so much. Wow, thank you guys.
Thank you.
In my mind, when I thought about putting this panel together, of course I thought it would work, but I didn't think that it would be this good. You guys have blown me away. Thank you again for taking the time. I know everyone is insanely busy, and I really appreciate it. And I think the people who joined us today got a real lesson. So thank you for joining us. And I'll turn it back over to you, Aaron.
Thank you so much, Keeanga. Thank you to Sarah Broom and Carroll Fife and Keisha-Khan Perry for your amazing presentations today. I will note, in case it's something you want to share, all the videos go up on the there's a link through the Princeton Mellon Initiative website if you'd like to share this conversation with others. And just a quick schedule reminder, we have our next session will be on April 14th on the theme of Indigenous environmental exploitation and Indigenous resistance. That will close out this semester's presentations. And until that time, our next Princeton Mellon Initiative event will be in our next conversation on our series on African urbanisms, which will be on April 7th at noon. So thank you so much for joining us, and be well.
Thank you. Thank you, Carol, Keeanga, Sarah.
Thank you. Shout out to Brandy Summers. Love you, sis.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes, Brandy.
Yeah. Hey,
Thanks
Brandy.
for joining us.
And all the students out there.